Experiences that we have been through in Southeast Asia is something that is becoming more common.
Depending on how the host country behaves, then you also have pockets of Chinese who consider themselves 中国人 at now, and some consider themselves 华侨, and some claiming that they are.
As someone who has been through this question of identity change, identity adaptation, and even just to understand the concept of multiple identities, how all of us, and I believe it is true of all of us, face the question of multiple identities in our lifetimes. By speaking in English, I underline the multiple nature of Chineseness that characterizes in a very peculiar way, characterizes in many ways, many peculiar ways, the Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, and I believe also elsewhere. Most of the Chinese communities who could afford this wanted their children to go to Chinese schools. So that's the first step of identification with China, that the children be taught in Chinese schools and taught in Chinese. So throughout the 1910s and 1920s, particularly after the 1911 revolution under the Republic, Chinese schools were built in every Chinese community in Southeast Asia. And for the teachers, most of them were not themselves teachers, they recruited teachers from China. And for the first time, more and more educated Chinese, literate teachers, could come to Southeast Asia to impart their Chinese consciousness, Chinese history, Chinese culture in a formal way, not just by custom and practice, but in a formal way in the classroom to the children of the now called Huaqiao, the Chinese living abroad. The vast majority of those of Chinese descent in Southeast Asia became more and more closely identified with China and wanted very much to be part of the Chinese experience of modernization, of revolution, of nation building. The picture was radically changed by the process of what we call decolonization, that is the pulling back, the withdrawal of all those European powers, and the return of sovereignty to the new nationalist leaders in each of the countries of Southeast Asia. The question was whether these Chinese would always remain loyal to China rather than to the places where they have settled, remained a question mark for many decades. It is interesting to remember, and I want to emphasize this, that the Chinese waited to see what the Chinese government would do. And of course, after 1949, as you all know, there were two Chinese governments. And the two Chinese governments said somewhat different things. And there were essentially three choices. One was to forget about living abroad and return home to China. One was to stay and completely accept local loyalty, become a loyal citizen of a new country and cut off their political connections with China totally. The third choice, the more ambiguous choice, was to say that they will remain, they will be loyal to the new nation, the new countries, on the political level, but they could keep and retain their Chinese culture, to separate political identity from cultural identity or ethnic identity. One very important factor was how did the governments treat these Chinese communities? A very difficult one to predict. The governments were not always consistent. We have to recognize that. The governments were not always consistent. The reason why the question of identity was so complicated for Southeast Asians was there were so many kinds of Chinese, different levels of different classes of Chinese, different governments, different kinds of indigenous peoples. Each group of Chinese had to respond according to the circumstances it found itself in. And so these are things which leave a lot of scholars who study the Chinese quite puzzled sometimes. How can you generalize about people who can range from those who are willing to assimilate totally with local people and those who are absolutely loyal to their Chinese values? The range is considerable and remains so till this day.
And nowadays, we can see that there is a global enthusiasm for learning Chinese, not just for Chinese descendants or Chinese people, but also for foreigners as well. So what influence do you think this will be for establishing or ensuring or finding a more distinctive identity for the overseas Chinese?
Now, this is a very controversial question. I'm just saying to you this, but it's very fundamental to people's attitudes about it. Why do Chinese families all over the world try so hard to have their children learn Chinese under very difficult circumstances? I once met someone who said, for Chinese people who really want to be Chinese, the Chinese language is like a religion. You must believe in it. It's so basic to being Chinese that unless you know the language, can speak it, you can never be truly Chinese. That's, some people believe that. There are other people, however, who say that being Chinese is much more complicated than the language. It has something to do with your inheritance as a person, your parents, if you're of Chinese blood, Chinese kinship, your kinship ties, your ethnicity, which includes your physical looks and what you look like. Being Chinese doesn't depend on your language. You may not speak a word of Chinese, you may not even think like a Chinese, you may not behave like a Chinese, but if others point to you and say you are a Chinese, what do? I once wrote about this. It hurt me to write it, but I once wrote about the subject of how Chinese people look to other Chinese people to see how Chinese they are. I think there's some truth in that.
Is there an open-minded way of treating the issue of identity? The most open-minded way in the era of globalization, treating the issue of so-called identity?
It depends on what you mean by globalization. Most of the time, people who talk about globalization are really talking about economic relations. That is true. Economic, trading, knowledge, particularly business knowledge, scientific and technological knowledge, that is being globalized. There is no question. But globalization of political entities, of culture, of other social and religious and other values, I think that's a long, long way to come. That's not going to happen very soon. The worry that I have is that the more globalized economic and scientific linkages and connections become, the more defensive people may become about their national identities and cultural identities, and therefore be less open instead of being more open. That would be my worry. I'm not confident that economic globalization will automatically lead to political and cultural globalization. I think the two are very separate processes and sometimes are actually in contradiction.